Welcome everyone to the 148th CG seminar, and which is the 21st of our seminars in the webinar format. And as we've reached the end of term in the UK, we're going to pause for 5 weeks. And I want to acknowledge that we've reached this point in our webinar series and thank Trevor Trehan for the wonderful job he's done in setting up and facilitating our webinars. And it's been a great pleasure to work with Trevor and with everyone in developing these webinars. The webinar format has been successful beyond our expectations. We now have not only an established participant audience which regularly appears in our webinars, we also have a process of imitation going on with the American Council on Education, which is a major lobbying organization on behalf of the whole higher education sector in DuPont Circle in Washington, now establishing its own webinar series in conscious imitation, or so they said to me, of our series. We've also been approached by Nottingham University in the last couple of days to use our webinar format and host a valedictory for a member of staff who led international education at Nottingham. So it's interesting to see the format becoming established and becoming used and imitated by others. And I think it shows that the pandemic has opened up the opportunity for global communication, and first as a matter of necessity and then as a matter of preference. We'll be using webinars come what may with the COVID-19 and its evolution in future, because clearly we are able to connect to people in a way which wouldn't otherwise be the case. And let me acknowledge our regular participants in the webinar series as it's evolved in the last 2.5 months. It's great to see the same people coming back again and again and asking questions on a range of topics. You know, people like Aki in Japan and Christina in Brazil and Lynn in Melbourne and Jura in Malaysia, Triff, our regulars, and your contribution is really appreciated. And I think that in this series, we are creating a kind of community around a range of topics and a range of issues, which is acknowledging the importance of every country situation within the global network. Let me now pass to today's topic and apologise to our presenters for holding them this long. Graduate unemployment and employment. Is there a more important topic in higher education at any time? Probably not. And it's an especially important topic as we look to the pandemic, the effects of the pandemic, and we hope the post-pandemic period. Graduate employability is a major driver now of policy and of policy on financing, policy on system organisation. Playing into the possible reorganisation of tertiary education in the UK, as we heard at our last webinar. And there are big issues arising during the pandemic, which is flattening the graduate labour market for a period of time, creating the possibility that a whole generation will be permanently affected and scarred, and the potential for the enhancement of inequalities that we always have in the graduate labour market between different categories of students in different parts of countries. So it's in the light of the importance of the topic, we're very fortunate to have such a good panel with us today. And I want to thank James Robson from Oxford, who's really framed this discussion, but we also have with us Anna Vignoles from Cambridge and Golo Henseke from UCL. I'll introduce each of the speakers when their time comes, and we're going to take them in order of James, Anna, and then Golo, and they'll each speak for 10 minutes. Following that, we'll have the Q&A session. Let me quickly go to the standard protocols, and this is where I always struggle because I lose the PowerPoint that I need when I need it. Just be patient with me. Here we are. Should be there now. That's it. As you know, if you're a regular, the Zoom webinar is recorded, and we post the recording within 2 or 3 days of the session on our website, and also it winds up on YouTube. So your question can be immortalized on YouTube if you wish. We also post the chat from the webinar, which is usually pretty lively as well. The webinar works on the basis of keeping our screens closed until we need to use them. So keep yourself muted unless you are being asked to speak or ask a question. There's no need to have your video on during the webinar, but please do so when you're asking a question. It makes it all more personal. We recommend using speaker view in Zoom so you can more clearly see who is talking when they talk. Now, to ask a question, and we really welcome questions from you, use the chat function. That way we can see what the question is about and we can ensure a good range of questions and that each of our speakers will receive a question. At the end of the 3 speeches, we'll then move to the Q&A, as I said, and if your question is then selected, you'll be invited into the webinar to ask it yourself directly. And when you're invited in, please unmute yourself. Most important step, switch on your video and this is the thing that everyone always forgets, state your name and where you are from, which again helps the webinar, helps us know what's happening, all know what's happening. So without further delay, let me pass into our first speaker, James. Now, James is a lecturer in higher education at the University of Oxford. He's a most valued colleague. All of us who work with James at Oxford have learned to rely on him on a broad range of issues, but he's particularly strong across the higher education, vocational and technical education divide, and he's Associate Director of Scope, which is an SRC centre at Oxford. His current research is focused on the intersection between the sectors, between professional learning and training systems, across skill supply and demand, graduate labour markets, and digitalisation and also social mobility issues, which all of us work on. So without further delay, James, over to you.
Thanks, Simon. Can I just check that you can hear me okay?
I can hear you well.
Fantastic, excellent. All right, so there's only so much that can be said in 10 minutes. So in this brief presentation, I'm just going to attempt to lay out the context and highlight what I see as some of the key implications of the pandemic for graduate employment and employability. I'll do this in a fairly holistic way, focusing largely on the English and UK contexts, and then Anna and Golo can go into more detail on some specific issues. I think there can be little doubt now that we are facing a youth unemployment crisis on a scale that hasn't been seen since the 80s. Commentary on the labour market has highlighted the enormous growth in unemployment during the lockdown, the huge reduction in vacancies, reduced by 65% compared to this period last year, and the growth in the number of people claiming universal benefit. COVID-19 has clearly caused a profound shock to the economy and the labour market as a whole. However, research on previous recessions has shown that the youth population is likely to be particularly badly hit in these conditions, with, for example, youth unemployment following the 2008 crash twice that of the overall population. Certainly, the immediate economic pressures of the lockdown hit those aged 16 to 24 hardest, with, according to the Resolution Foundation, young people being much more likely to have been made redundant at the beginning of the crisis, much more likely to have been furloughed, and much more likely to lose their jobs once the furlough scheme ends, when compared with their older and more experienced colleagues. Therefore, those graduating from higher education and entering the labour market at this time are going to face significant challenges. In a report published yesterday by the Sutton Trust, the issues students and graduates are already facing are clearly laid out, and I'll quickly list some of the findings. 46% of students say COVID-19 has made it harder for them to find a graduate job. 18% of students have experienced placements being cancelled or postponed. 11% have had interviews cancelled. 4% have had job offers withdrawn. On the employer side of the research project, 61% of employers have cancelled some or all of their work experience placements this summer, particularly small and medium-sized employers. And 39% of employers report they are likely to be hiring fewer graduates or none at all over the next 12 months. Clearly then, the lived experience for the majority of graduates entering the labour market in 2020, and in all likelihood in a number of subsequent years, is going to be characterised by competition for a small number of graduate level jobs. Cultural and economic capital, institutional prestige, degree subject, work experience, skills developed at university, and institutional support in facilitating labour market transitions will all be major factors in individuals successfully navigating this contested space and gaining graduate level employment. Those that are unsuccessful in the graduate level jobs market will face competition in the congested wider youth labour market and may need to navigate the range of national support measures announced by Chancellor Rishi Sunak on July the 8th. That's the Kickstart plan to subsidise work placements or traineeships. However, all of these measures are likely to provide salaries well below pre-crisis graduate averages. And given the likely long-term nature of the youth unemployment crisis, congestion across the whole youth labour market will only increase as each new cohort of education leavers enters the job market. As such, it seems very likely that the pandemic will have an immediate impact on graduates' labour market outcomes, with a large number experiencing extensive periods of under and unemployment. It also seems very likely that this is going to be a long-term issue. Whatever form economic recovery takes, whether we're looking at a V-shaped recovery or, as a worst-case scenario, an L-shape, evidence has shown that the youth jobs market recovery is usually 3 to 5 years behind wider economic recoveries. We could therefore be looking at a very long-term and protracted employment crisis, which, as I've said, is likely to get incrementally worse as more and more graduates and education leavers flood into a constricted labour market at the end of each academic year. This is what happened in the 80s, and I'm not convinced that the policymakers or universities are planning for these long-term challenges yet. So, why does any of this matter? Well, at an individual level, we know from recent research on the 2008 recession that periods of under and unemployment as graduates transition into and navigate the labour market have a long-term scarring effect on individuals' career trajectories and lifetime earnings. I think Anna will go into more depth on this issue and show how stark these impacts are. Importantly, and not particularly surprisingly, these effects are not felt equally across regions, socioeconomic statuses, HE institutions, or degree subject areas. Graduates from disadvantaged areas with disadvantaged backgrounds and from less elite institutions are going to struggle more in the labour market and will be more likely to experience significant scarring. Therefore, the pandemic labour market is very likely to deepen pre-existing social and geographic inequalities and widen gaps in prestige between institutions. This has far-reaching implications for social mobility and societal fairness. So the implications for the pandemic, for the graduates' labour market and their outcomes at individual levels are relatively clear and not particularly good. However, the implications for higher education institutions are much more complex. Aside from the probable issues around widening the gaps in prestige between institutions, universities face the question of how best to support their graduates transitioning into the labour market in a way that will alleviate the scarring effects. There's no clear answer to this, and it comes at a time when most institutions are already struggling with stretched finances, question marks over student numbers, an overworked and depleted workforce, and the challenges of delivering courses online or using hybrid approaches. It seems likely that 3 factors are going to be critical in institutional support: up-to-date careers advice and guidance, supporting students to gain work experience, and supporting students to develop appropriate skills for the labour market. All of these come with challenges. Clearly, up-to-date advice is difficult in an increasingly digitalised educational context, and the way in which economic recovery is shaping sectors in different ways. At the same time as the clear contraction of the labour market, the changes already taking place in relation to the nature of work through digitalisation, automation, gigification, and the growth of the digital and platform economy are likely to accelerate following lockdowns as organisations put in place digital solutions to maintain productivity or want to avoid risk of further disruption. This will lead, or likely lead, to changes in skills demands with a particular focus on digital skills, intensified by occupational restructuring in the face of a long-term employment crisis. Given previous research on skills formation systems, Shadbolt's useful report on computer science skills, for example, these skills are most likely to be developed in workplace settings. This is the much documented experience trap. In order to get a job, you first need to have a job. This was already challenging for many students before the crisis. At a time when most work experience opportunities have now been removed, this is going to be particularly difficult for individuals, and institutions therefore face the dilemma of whether, how much and how they should build just-in-time employability skills more explicitly into degree courses. The implications of this may be a very crowded curriculum stretched in online contexts with subject-specific knowledge fighting for a place beside activities focused on the formation of skills that might otherwise have been developed in extracurricular activities or work placements. Now, although most of the emerging reports related to graduate labour markets have focused on the potential challenges graduates will face and the scarring effects of unemployment, there are wider implications for the state. Setting aside the issues individuals face, from a purely economic perspective, if the challenges of a constrained labour market cause graduates to have periods of unemployment, take on low salaried work simply to get a job, and their lifetime earnings are compromised, student loan repayments will be reduced. This is a particular concern for the English system with its high fees and income contingent loans. Before the recession, only 40% of loans were repaid, and with repayments only kicking in when graduates earn over £26,000, it's very likely that the post-Covid-19 repayments will reduce across the board. This means that the RAB charge the government pays to meet the gap between loans and repayments will inevitably be increased, adding further stresses to an already stretched economy. So as was discussed in the seminar on Tuesday, I think concerns about student loan repayment, that this student loan repayment shortfall are already clear in the policy discourses related to the proposed restructuring of the tertiary sector. This was particularly apparent in Gavin Williamson's headline-grabbing announcement of the removal of Tony Blair's 50% HE target and increased rhetoric around the dangers of low-value degrees. So in the short term, the HE policy implications of a youth unemployment crisis are already clear. They involve a doubling down on using graduate outcomes as a key metric and mechanism of institutional governance, and an increased emphasis on understanding degree value in terms of individualised financial returns. This can already be seen in England in the guidelines established for bailing out universities in financial difficulties, where high return subjects will be emphasised. Focus on financial returns was already increasing in HE systems that have a simplistic model of human capital theory embedded at policy level and emphasise the value of HE in terms of private returns rather than public good. It's arguable that COVID-19 has accelerated this trend such that the sole importance of individual financial returns is now firmly entrenched in policy level discourse. The longer term implications of this are already causing serious concerns for those involved in the arts and humanities, or subjects related to social care, nursing, etc., that are all associated with low financial returns. Such subjects may face an imminent crisis in both funding and student numbers, with serious consequences for the shape of the HE sector and the nature of knowledge. However, to end on a slightly more positive note, perhaps this is the moment that the HE sector can challenge the policy focus on graduate employment, which has been largely what I've been discussing so far, and focus or refocus the discourse and language to that of employability, the way in which individuals are empowered to navigate the labour market in a way that best suits their needs and aspirations. Clearly, measuring outcomes is going to become increasingly meaningless in a youth unemployment crisis, and will more likely lead to measuring the measuring of individual capital and institutional prestige than anything that took place during graduate degrees. Perhaps, therefore, one potential outcome of the pandemic is the opportunity to disrupt the discursive and policy trend and reintroduce broader understandings of degree value in terms of employability, as well as wider educational aims associated with subject-specific realms of knowledge and self-formation. I think I'll leave it there.
Well, powerful stuff, James. Thank you very, very much for that tremendous introduction to the set of issues. And just at the time when the education economy relationship becomes highly disrupted and problematic in an arguably abnormal situation, although a fairly protracted one, we're likely to see a strengthening of the demand to include economic metrics as policy drivers in higher education. So just when those metrics aren't working properly, they can be, if you like, there can be a redoubled commitment to them. But I think your point is that in a rational universe, we'd think again about that, and we would open up a larger discussion about employability and self-formation in higher education. So thanks very, very much. And we'll look forward to your contribution in the Q&A. Our second speaker is Anna Vignoles. It's delightful to welcome Anna to the CG webinars, and she's Professor of Education in the Faculty of Education at the University of Cambridge, Fellow of the British Academy, and a trustee of the Nuffield Foundation, and a very well-known and respected economist of education in the UK. She undertakes research into how we can improve students' academic achievement and help them develop the skills they need in the labour market. She has a particular interest in researching inequalities we see in access to education globally and in the UK. And she's interested in the lower levels of educational success of children from poorer families and measures that can address that. So she's an expert on the outcomes of higher education and has played a very significant role in policy in the recent years. She has, for example, advised Dame Shirley Pearce's inquiry into the Teaching Excellence Framework Review. She's on the Sutton Trust Advisory Board. She's advised the DfE and numerous other government departments, including Treasury in the UK. So over to you, Anna.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you for inviting me today, and James for a fantastic summary of all the issues. I have a feeling this is going to be one seminar where lots of the speakers are agreeing with each other. I'm also living this experience with two young people in my household, very much experiencing the difficulties of the youth labour market. So it's an interesting time, as they say. So I think there are a couple of issues that we should be concerned about, obviously. First of all, we are going to see the COVID generations really struggling to get a foot on the ladder, as James has set out so eloquently. And for them, the question is partly, how big is this dip going to be? How long is it going to last? Are we talking a V, a U, an L-shaped recovery? And those are questions that are not restricted to the UK. It's a question about the global economy. That's a really important question for the economy as a whole. But I think it's really important to bear in mind that actually for the COVID generations who are literally leaving higher education now, trying to enter the labour market, even if there is a recovery far faster than we fear, they will still be affected. And the reason why we know that is if we look at past evidence from recessions and the economic scarring effects that it has on young people, what we find is that those that are sort of very acutely affected by the crisis, the ones that are trying to make that transition just at the wrong moment, have a scarring impact, or the recession has a scarring impact that lasts, well, if we look at evidence from the 2008 recession, it lasts forever, i.e. they're still experiencing it. And so I think that's a really important thing to bear in mind, that we could have a recovery that looks a little bit better than we'd feared, and yet we will still have these generations of young people experiencing really acute difficulties in the labour market. The other thing to bear in mind from that literature on economic scarring is that the scarring effects, as James alluded to, are far worse for the lower skilled. So on the face of it, the graduates are going to be in a better position than the non-graduates in terms of the long-term impact of this crisis. But of course, it doesn't mean that there's no impact on them. It means that they are essentially displacing non-graduate workers. So down the line, we're also going to see this phenomenon of lots of graduates who enter the labour market just at the wrong moment, doing jobs for which they arguably at least are overqualified. Now, what's the likely impact, or what are young people going to do about this? I mean, the first thing is, obviously, many of them will want to hide in higher education. So they will want to extend their studies somehow. They may want to take master's degrees. People who otherwise might have left without doing a degree may want to study at university. And of course, with those higher education institutions globally, but particularly in the UK and the US, feeling the financial pressures very, very acutely, universities are going to be welcoming these students. So there is I guess, a note of optimism here, where we might say that one of the effects of the crisis could be to see a larger number of students continuing in education longer, taking postgraduate study. But the problem with that is that our systems are not set up particularly well to help the poorest students do that. And it will, of course, be the wealthier students whose parents can afford to essentially shelter them in higher education and ride out the worst of this recession. And so James is quite right to say that we are going to see widening inequalities in terms of outcomes. But the sting in the tail is not only are we going to be seeing widening inequalities, but also higher education is going to be implicated in those inequalities. In other words, it will be the fact that we are able to admit many students from wealthy backgrounds to master's degrees and PhDs that keep them in higher education during the crisis moment, that protects them and allows them to then go on and hopefully graduate into a better labour market, leaving those from poorer backgrounds behind. I think one thing that we may want to also focus on is some of the issues that James was alluding to about labour market outcomes for students taking different subjects and attending different universities. So there were some issues in the graduate labour market well before COVID came along. Our research has looked at the graduate wage premium for different degrees, different subjects, different disciplines, different institutions. And it's clear that for some, higher education is not giving them a wage premium. Does that matter? Coming back to Simon's point, of course not. You do higher education for many reasons. Advantage in the labour market is only one of them. But what it does imply is that even in the good days before COVID, some graduates were experiencing quite difficult situations when it came to trying to find a job that matched their skills, and they were not earning a wage premium as a result of their degree. Now, one of the reasons why they may not have been earning a premium is also linked to location. Some parts of the UK, the graduate wage premium is very low, and indeed employment opportunities are very limited. And one of the challenges we're going to face as we try and work out what it is that we do to protect these generations is to figure out what the role of place is in all of this. It's all very well saying that a particular area has an institution that is producing graduates with low wages. They're producing graduates who are not earning more than non-graduates. What is the point of that institution if you look at it from an economic perspective? Well, the point of the institution is it will be doing many other things in its local environment. It will be, if you like, an anchor institution potentially for economic activity in that area. And if we are guided purely by wages, we're going to have a significant problem when it comes to the place agenda, because we will see widening inequalities across the different regions of the UK. So the other issue I think that's important is that higher education can't get away from the fact that we do have students who are leaving with degrees who appear, even in more sort of buoyant times and in more buoyant locations, to not be able to secure earnings that are above their non-graduate counterparts. And if that was simply because they wanted to choose unusual jobs that don't pay well, we wouldn't be worried about it. But research suggests that's not the case. Research suggests that there are sets of skills that employers really want to see in their employees and that they're willing to pay a premium for. And I think one of the challenges we have that's very particular in the UK, but in some other countries too, is that our degrees are narrow. And so some of those subjects that appear to not attract very high wage premium are in, as Simon said, creative arts and other humanities subjects. The question is, should they be including a broad range of skills? And I'm not talking about employability skills in the way that James was referring to. I'm talking about a broad range of cognitive academic skills, because that is what the labour market appears to want. In other words, instead of getting overly hung up and focused on whether or not we should have STEM or non-STEM and whether we should have a particular degree subject versus another, we could just recognise that employers do need their graduates to come in with a broad range of skills, and that regardless of what subject or discipline you're studying, it would be advantageous for the graduates to have those broad skills that are in such demand in the labour market. And that could be a project that universities might want to think about tackling right at the moment, because it would also have the benefit of improving employment prospects, assuming that we can get the broader economy back on track. Yes, I do think that universities will be starting to get very serious about employability support. I don't think it's just about employability skills. I think it's about career guidance, it's about coaching, it's about taking that transition into the labour market extremely seriously. And it's about universities seeing it as their prime responsibility to help their students make that transition. Not all universities see it as their prime responsibility to help students make that transition, some do. And I think that's one change that we might see going forward. But in summary, one thing I think we do need to be mindful in all of this is, going back to what Simon says, whatever we do in higher education, whatever we do indeed in education policy, whatever we do on this supply side, it cannot compensate for a catastrophic recession. There is nothing you can do purely about, in terms of developing individual skills that can compensate for the fall in demand that comes with a big recession. So the most important policy here to get things back on track and to protect those generations, those COVID generations trying to enter the labour market, is to get the broader economy thriving again. And so there's a whole set of challenges in doing that. And it's really important that we as a sector recognise that, because there is a tendency, I think, to think that a supply side response can do it all. And in my view, that's really not going to be the case. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Anna, that's brilliant. And thank you for putting the equity issue so squarely and clearly. The unequal access to the shelter that you discussed, and the way in which you focused on place, and the importance of regionality in the UK context, very profound in social terms. And also the way you talked about what universities can do now to facilitate the transition into work. So we look forward to further discussion of all those issues in the Q&A. And I noticed that while you were speaking, our numbers in the webinar were mounting up, and we're currently sitting on 128. I think we might have got to 129 a second ago. So I think without delay, we better get to Golo, and then we'll get back to the Q&A. Golo Henseke at UCL, a valued colleague in the Centre for Global Higher Education, someone we look to now for major papers on graduate employment, and not only in the UK, but in Europe and worldwide. Golo focuses on job quality, graduate labour market skills, and graduate employability. We look forward to your contribution, Golo.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Anna and James, for preparing the ground so excellently. So we heard a lot about how recessions, or this recession is going to affect the current cohort of graduates who are entering the labor market and are at this critical stage in their life transitions. However, recessions are also a time during which structural change in the economy can accelerate. So unlike shocks and the associated scarring effects that we're going to see, structural changes can alter the distribution of opportunities across sociodemographic groups permanently. And Anna and James already alluded to some potential mechanisms. In the following, I want to explore this a little bit with this issue, a little bit with with an analysis of past data, what have happened particularly after the financial crisis of 2008. A major trend that has gone unnoticed mostly, especially outside the US, has been the surge in jobs that require a degree. With pressure on wages and fewer vacancies in high-skilled occupations, graduates have moved down into middle-skilled jobs and replaced non-graduates in the process. This has contributed among graduates to widening dispersion of outcomes, but on the other hand, limit opportunities for non-graduates to actually access well-paid employment. In the US, job vacancies requiring a bachelor's degree rose from 23% in 2007 to 37% by 2019, according to a recent paper. Maybe against expectation, the change was actually more pronounced in knowledge-based occupations such as professionals, managers, and technicians. But we know actually very little about how this move towards jobs that require a degree as a minimum educational qualification to access has played out outside the US. Some scholars, especially economists, have argued that this increase in demand for university degrees is evidence for upskilling. So jobs have become more skill intensive and therefore they require these graduates across a broad range of jobs that previously didn't use graduate labor. However, others suggest that this might be just ratcheting up of education requirements without any economic or technical pressures. And that's a very old question about what's the purpose of degrees in the labor markets. The optimists believe that new technology improve the productivity of skilled workers and as a result continue to push up the demand for graduates, and organizations and employers take recessions as a time to invest in future technologies. And this is then evidenced by rising qualification requirements. For the pessimists, information communication technology, so the drivers that previously have moved the demand for skilled labor up, has matured, become less skill biased. And this is then evidenced, for example, by rising graduate employment outside what is typically considered graduate jobs. And that's something I and Francis Green have looked into previous research. Either way, it seems that employers use slack labor markets for educational upgrading, so a growing number of jobs requiring degree qualification. But what is it? Is it job upskilling, or is it simply educational upgrading without any economic or technological pressures? Qualitative case studies of a few new graduate jobs after the last recession suggest that degrees serve actually multiple context-dependent functions. Job upskilling may be part of the story, but it's definitely not the full story that there is to be told. To better understand the antecedents and consequences of the changing share of changing share of jobs requiring degree qualifications at scale, we had to look at worker-reported job task and qualification data from the British Skills and Employment Survey. And we found three key findings from our analysis. Trevor, can you put up the slides, please? So the first thing is, we see indeed an increase in jobs that require a degree. This share between 1997 and 2017 almost doubled from 15% to 29%. It took about a decade for the share of jobs requiring degrees to increase by like 5 points from 1997 to 2006, but that was then followed by a 6-point jump for the period 2006 and 12, which coincides with the Great Recession. And we have a continued edging up of that share since 2012. This change, we find, was concentrated but not limited to managerial, administrative, and professional occupations. By 2017, more than 70% of higher managerial, administrative administrative and professional occupations required a degree, up from just about half 20 years earlier. The share of jobs requiring degrees in intermediate occupations rose to 15% according to our survey data. So overall, these trends look very similar to what we've seen in the US. But again, is it upskilling, or is it just educational upgrading? And that's something we looked at by comparing by looking at how the task content of jobs has actually changed alongside the degree requirements. Trevor, can you move to the next slide, please? Our basic idea is that job tasks require specific skills to be carried out competently, and upskilling should therefore be evident in a change in the task content of jobs. And we term this task-warranted job upskilling. The alternative is that education requirements increase in otherwise unchanged jobs. And we find in this first slide that this graph shows that between 1997 and 2006, task-warranted job upskilling explains the entire increase in jobs requiring degrees. By contrast, Trevor, next slide, please. Thank you. By contrast, only around a quarter of the 8.4-point surge in job share of jobs requiring degree qualification was grounded in task-warranted job upskilling in the second period. So there's been a clear change in how much job upskilling can explain the growing share of jobs requiring degree qualifications. Seems that employers, especially in the second period, increased the educational requirements for otherwise unchanged jobs. In this accurate analysis for the entire period, we find that there was task-warranted job upskilling across the board, but there's also been a notable fraction of education upgrading in otherwise unchanged jobs, especially in elite occupations at the top of the hierarchy. So if not to meet increased skills demands, what reasons might employers have to recruit graduates and change to graduates persistently? The literature hypothesizes that better actual or perceived trainability might be one of the explanations. And that's something we actually tested with the data. And we found that there's a substantial trainability advantage of young graduates over other post-18 education leavers in the same job. Graduates require about 20% less time to learn and about 30% less time to train before they can do the job well. So there's this trainability advantage, and that is even larger in intermediate and routine occupations. So employers might use recessions to use recessions like labor markets, the associated wage pressure to recruit graduates for occupations that didn't really pay, and in these conditions, they can cut. There's the potential to cut training and learning times. With the coronavirus's impact on the economy, there's the risk that the trend towards degree requirements across a growing proportion of occupations will again pick up pace. Much like in the last recessions, graduates will seek employment where they can, as James and Anna alluded. With pressures on wages, employers can fill positions with graduates where previously did not pay. The consequences might be a further push of graduates into lower managerial and professional jobs and intermediate occupations that don't use graduate skills, but take advantage of better trainability or higher trainability. As ours and other analyses have shown, education requirements tend to ratchet up. Once institutions employers appear to have very little incentive to reduce education requirements. Widening degree requirements now could therefore have lasting impact on the labor market, on the structure of the labor market for the future. This trend towards degree requirements coincides as well with a long-term decline in the volume of workplace training in Britain. It seems that this expansion of higher education with the expansion of higher education and the growing supply of graduates, employers increasingly rely on the individual and the state to provide job-ready skill sets. And this trend towards both these trends, once to more widespread degree requirements and less work-based training, become a double whammy, especially for non-graduates that can squeeze them out relatively well-paid, high and relatively high-paid, high and middle-skilled jobs. And there's some indication for this if we look in past employment data. Among young workers, 20 to 34-year-olds, the non-graduate employment share in managerial professional jobs fell by 35%, compared with just 12% outside this labor market segment since 2001. So while not definitive, the pattern is indicative of a redistribution of opportunities, not just within graduates, but across the wider labor market. This issue is particularly problematic if qualifications primarily serve to exclude are not just an indicator or a certificate of skills. However, if employers are looking for a more complex mix of skills among which education credentials are only a signal among many, then the role and the actual degree access jobs may have actually a more limited role in the redistribution process. So recently announced efforts to strengthen further education may actually help, especially non-graduates, to hold on to well-paid jobs. But unless employers can be convinced that the offering delivers valuable skills, or even better, get actually involved in skills training, there are going to be headwinds. If university degrees have become legitimate markers of cultural fit or sickness of unobservable abilities, attempts to strengthen further education or school-based technical vocational education may struggle unless middle-class parents are prepared to send their children to further education institutions. Disappointing experiences with new offerings over the last decade around technical secondary education in England suggest that there are headwinds ahead. So in all our findings from our research of past trends suggest that degree qualifications have varied and fluid functions in the labor market. This goes beyond human capital signaling or credentialism. A pure upskilling, a pure signaling interpretation of rising education requirements seem too narrow. And depending on the length and depth of the recession, there's the potential for not only scarring effects of current graduates, but also permanent redistribution of opportunities with widening of social and spatial inequalities. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Golo. It was very, very rich. And I mean, your work on job skills analysis gives an objective content to this question of a graduate job, which is otherwise rather rubbery and slips around a bit over time. But you've given us a way to think about the content of the work and also the relationship between pre-work and work-based training. And I think too, your work also throws some light on the old question, the sort of 50, 60-year-old debate about the human capital and signalling functions respectively. And I think alerts us to the importance of the signalling function without saying it's the only thing going on. It's clearly one of the factors in play. And while it's a factor in play, you would think that it'll be pretty difficult to wean the middle class parent away from the dependence on the tertiary hierarchy as a sort of way of thinking about where children should be going for their post-school education. Well, we've reached the Q&A stage and we've got about 15 minutes. I'd like to bring in Daria Luchenskaya to ask the first question. Daria, are you there?
I am there. Hello. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So, hi, I'm Daria. I'm from the University of Strathclyde. Thank you very much for a really interesting discussion. It's clearly very topical, and a lot of the pre-existing issues in the graduate labour market have intensified under COVID. I just wanted to ask a sort of broad question. It seems that it is a good moment to question what higher education is for and its broader values other than its sort of labour market outcomes. But it seems to me quite a difficult thing to challenge, just because this whole discussion is taking place in decades of discourse that has been emphasizing the role of higher education as a way to graduates getting good jobs. It also relies on using indicators that are easier to quantify than others, and so lend themselves to numerical analysis, big data, all this predictive stuff that's currently happening. So I think it's going to be really difficult to break out of that, just because we're going against the tide. So that's my question, really, how to do this. Thank you.
Thanks, Daria. That's a question which I think all three of you could answer. And perhaps we'll take James first.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a great question, and one which I don't have an answer to. Obviously, if I did, I think I'd, if I could change decades of discursive policy, then I'd be a very clever person, and my impact case study would be very, very nice. I think there's part of what we have to deal with is probably not as a sector, and as a tertiary sector more generally, is not get sucked into dichotomous thinking. It's not either or. It's not either you value graduate outcomes or you value something else, be that self-formation, be it subject knowledge. It's actually embracing the kind of complexity of the field and saying that actually parents value all of these, and young people value all of these things. And so it's trying to make sure that we, in our response to this sort of reductive approach in policy, don't replace it or don't attempt to replace it with a similarly reductive approach. So I think that's the first thing. The other thing is yes, not to be purely negative, not to just sit and wring our hands about the problems of LEO or graduate outcomes, and provide meaningful alternatives. I think there's lots and lots of different stakeholders that can contribute to that. There are people involved in the practice of providing careers, guidance, and so on and so forth, who can start to shape some of these discourses, and they do contribute to things emphasizing employability rather than employment. There are key players involved in higher education governance who can start to contribute to all of this. There are, I think, employers, their voice can, I think, increasingly be brought in. I think just sort of skimming comments, I saw something from Diana Laurillard highlighting that employers value skills around history and so on and so forth, because those subjects teach people to think. And so, you know, the employer voice is there. It's saying the things that I think people who want to change that policy discourse want them to say. So it's just a way of amplifying those voices, amplifying the voices of these different stakeholders to make sure that we have a much more complex picture.
Good, thanks, James. I think I'll move to a next question rather than take responses from the other two speakers. We'll make sure that you each get a question. Julie Allen. Hi, Julie.
Hi, nice to see you, Simon. Yeah, I'm the Director of Policy and Services at UKISA, the UK Council for International Student Affairs. And so my question is really about the supporting that we can provide to international students. So there's a lot of discussion about the drop that's expected in the number of international students that will come to study in the UK this year and probably around the world globally. And the government has promised that it's going to introduce a new graduate route to allow international graduates to study for 2 years after they complete their studies, to work after their studies. And so I'm interested to hear what the panel's thoughts are about enticing international students and encouraging them to come to the UK with the promise of finding work after they complete their studies, in the context of a market, a place where there are much fewer jobs and the competition is much higher, as James outlined at the very start. We know that applications from India in particular have really gone up since the announcement about the new graduate route, and they take out huge loans in order to come and study in the UK with the hope that they'll be able to work in the UK to pay off those loans. So I'm just interested in your thoughts on what that means for us in the UK and anything that we could be doing to support non-UK students.
Yes, so when you change all the normal parameters, there are many domino effects. And one, of course, is a post-study work visa policy, and the debate we've been having about that for years seemed to be resolved before the pandemic, and then look what happened. The labour market got flattened. Anna, do you want to give us your wisdom on that? It's a hard question, I think.
Well, it is. I mean, I'm going to cheat and say that the biggest factor that will affect international students coming is what we say and do over the next month in terms of ensuring people's safety as much as is feasible, or at least giving a clear signal that universities are open for business, and more crucially that the country can cope with that and has safe systems in place. And I say that because I think some of the we expected perhaps a sharper decline in student numbers, international student numbers, and one of the reasons I think we may not have had it is because relative to the US at least we may be seen to be marginally more on top of things, but I think that issue is really serious. When it comes to the visa, well, we don't get good data on what happens to international students generally who wanted to stay and then can't find work. And we won't even after, you know, this is over, because obviously if they fail to find work, they'll go home. So it might be a very good incentive, and we'll never know whether it delivered in large numbers, or we're not going to have good information on that. The one thing I would say, and it comes back to Diana's point in the chat about what skills are in demand, etc. A lot of international students coming for postgraduate degrees are studying subjects for which there is actually relatively strong demand in the UK labour market. As people who are on the recruitment side of quantitative PhDs know, it's actually quite hard to get UK students that are adequately qualified to come and study PhDs in some subjects. We have fantastic international students applying. So we have a really vibrant higher education system, partly because of the quality of our international students coming in, but it also does reveal some of the issues around lack of supply of UK students in certain subject areas. And I'm very clear that I'm not arguing that we should have more economists and fewer historians purely for economic reasons, but I think we do need to be mindful that the UK, contrary to discourse, actually has a very large supply of some of these degree subjects that people are most concerned about protecting, interestingly enough. If you look at the numbers in creative arts and humanities, they're very large. So I think we need to be a little bit careful to balance our understandable fears that the crude accountability system will be used to bash subjects in a very, very unfortunate way, versus being a little bit mindful of the labour market needs. And to come back to the previous question, even though I wasn't asked it, there is this issue also. If you go and ask students from lower income backgrounds, they are very clear that they want good job prospects from higher education. And so even if we need to be far more sophisticated in how we measure success in higher education, and we do need to recognise the wider value of a degree, we cannot go down the route of ignoring the needs of students, particularly from poorer backgrounds, who ultimately do need a job at the end of it.
I absolutely agree, Anna, and I think it's really important to keep both balls in the air and to persuade everyone else to do the same. And the problem is we get into these holistic either-or discussions where if you argue for the broader value of a degree, then you're arguing against an economic agenda. And if you're arguing for the importance of employability and getting a good graduate job or getting a job, then you're arguing against the broader value of a degree, when clearly every piece of evidence we have about students and graduates says they want all these things at once, and yes, they're quite right too. And we can provide them. That's the thing. I mean, I think your point too about providing a safe, secure health and welfare environment, not only for international students, but for everyone, crucial Absolutely. Issue right now. That's the biggest issue in higher education, not only in the UK. Can I bring in Nick Ratcliffe now?
Thank you, Simon. This was a question really inspired by Anna's comments about breadth, and particularly for arts and creative subjects, that somehow the universities really had a duty to make sure that students studied more than just what it was that they sort of signed up for, really. I speak as an English graduate who learned almost nothing of use in 3 years studying English, but did some other stuff around that which made me employable. Is it enough really to rely on students to act in their own self-interest? Or do universities need to do more to sort of push some of that breadth to make their graduates employable?
The temptation is to give this to Golo, but I think it has been asked of you, Anna, so can you pick it up but quickly, and then I'll pass to Golo, because he will have something to say as well.
Very briefly, one, breadth applies to STEM subjects. STEM subjects come out without being able to write, that's not good either. Two, definitely we cannot leave it up to students. This has to be something that universities own.
Golo, your thoughts, and perhaps in response to all the questions.
Agreed. I think we will see more, as already mentioned, I think we'll see more and greater efforts by university to place students and graduates in the labor market in the coming years, given the importance of employability outcomes for all sorts of metrics. That's definitely going to be take priority, and it's going to be interesting to see how universities solve that. What programs and initiatives they're going to develop in this time, because I mean a lot of workplace training can't take place as we used to. We're going to see, I think, quite a few innovations there, actually.
Thanks, Golo. Claire Callender.
Hi, so I'm at UCL and part of CG. Given the predicted dramatic rise in graduate unemployment and underemployment and the downward pressure on wages, what are the implications for the TEF?
Anna, I think you're our TEF expert.
Policy. Yeah, it's got to be
I
Anna.
get,
Sorry, Anna.
Thank you very much for that one, Claire. Okay, so I mean, first of all, Dame Shirley Pearce's review of the TEF needs to be considered urgently.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously the pandemic has put everything on hold appropriately, but we need to get back to that business of thinking about how it is that we want to, quote unquote, judge universities. And we need, as Simon has alluded to come with a balance between, we cannot be the only sector that gets to determine what success looks like by itself with no regulation. That is not a world that anybody outside of higher education would see as fair. It's not fair on students, and it doesn't feel fair to, you know, the institutions that are subject to regulation. Equally, crude and poor regulatory frameworks are incredibly damaging, and we have a fantastically high quality higher education sector. And my advice to the government would be careful what you do with it. It needs protecting during this pandemic because, you know, a crisis should not destroy it. But that does not mean that all institutions and all degrees are equally high quality or valuable in the broadest sense. So we need a TEF, we need a broader set of metrics, and we need a more sophisticated, you know, more self-evaluative approach to being honest about where the quality is and is not in higher education.
Thank you.
I want to thank all three colleagues for a wonderful webinar, and clearly the discussion that could flow for quite some time if we had the time to do that. So we look forward to bringing these three presenters back again in a future webinar and to discuss these issues again, because I think we'll be following graduate employment and unemployment, employability now for the foreseeable future as perhaps the most sensitive set of issues in the higher education policy environment. Let me again say thank you to all of those who've taken part in the webinar series during this Northern Hemisphere academic year 2019 to 20, which is now, for our purposes, drawing to a close. We will shut down for 5 weeks, and our next webinar will take place on Thursday, the 3rd of September. It's a discussion of on the perennial and centrally important topic of higher education and sustainability. And it will be led by Tristan McGowan from UCL Institute of Education, and will include 3 further speakers from different countries around the world to discuss those issues. I'm sure too in September we'll be talking about COVID-19 and higher education and science, the issues that we've been discussing this year. So once again, thank you, Trevor Trehan, for all you've done to facilitate our series. Thank you to the CG Research Management Committee, which sustained, supported, and has participated actively in this webinar series. Thank you to all the regulars who've been checking in for each of our webinars, and it's delightful that we're bringing something useful to you and that you're helping to constitute a global higher education policy and research community. So thank you all. For those of you who are taking some break time in the Northern Hemisphere, have a good vacation. Stay safe. Come back healthy and well to our webinar series in the academic year 2020 to 21. Thank you all.